I am so excited to be here today. I just want to thank the Kappas for inviting me. Thank you so much, and for Kat Carvana for connecting me to the Kappas. It's really an absolute pleasure to be here today. Um, I'm so sorry I couldn't be there physically, but I'm so glad to be here in any way, shape, or capacity. It's always such a blessing to help other Pinays out and to speak to other Pinays. Um, Today, I'm going to be talking about my experiences in higher education and student affairs. Briefly, a little bit about myself. I'm a student affairs professional. I've been in the field for over 8 years. I currently work at Cal State LA as a coordinator of the cross-cultural centers, where I directly oversee the Asian Pacific Islander Student Resource Center and the Chicano Latino Student Resource Center, and our STAR student success and retention programs. On top of working with the cross-cultural centers at Cal State LA, I also worked at the cultural centers at USF at the University of San Francisco. I also was working with first gen, first year programs, and worked at De Anza College and at San Jose State. So yeah, I'm so excited to be here today to talk about my experiences as a Pinay in higher education. So I have a little presentation to share with you all. So let me switch over there. But afterwards, I know that Kathleen is going to switch over to a Q&A with me. So, oh, I went too far. Sorry about that. So my workshop today is on the makings of a Pinay scholar, a personal reflection on colonization and the Ivory Tower for empowerment and personal agency. My workshop overview, I'm gonna do some personal reflection on colonization and the Ivory Tower. I'm gonna be talking about Pinays in higher education. What now? So what does that mean in terms of empowerment and personal agency? And again, Kathleen's gonna connect me via Q&A afterwards. And also, feel free to connect with me via social media at Define Life. Also, I'm available via email as well. So learning outcomes, discuss societal and institutional barriers Filipinas and Filipinos scholars encounters in their academic pursuits, share ways culture can impact the academic experiences of Filipinos in higher education, suggest action steps towards empowerment and personal agency. So again, my name is Diana Pondavia Victa. I identify as Pinay, first generation, working class, a social justice educator, and again, as a student affairs professional. But before I go into the nitty gritty of stuff, I do want to talk a little bit about where I come from, because where I come from is very much important in the type of work I do and my values as a social justice educator and student affairs professional. So this is me and my family. I was born in the Philippines. The photo to your right is right before we immigrated. We immigrated when I was only 2 years old. And during the time in the Philippines, it was the Marcos dictatorship era. And so what that meant for my family is because there was a lot of political repression that was happening. My parents wanted to escape to give a better life for my siblings and I. They saw that there wasn't much hope for education or a career for us over there. So they left everything behind to make sure that we would live a better life. So we moved to Concord, California. Concord, California is not too far away from UC Davis. It's a couple of minutes, but I grew up here most of my life. Concord, California, I would say, is predominantly white. And so growing up in a predominantly white community, being an immigrant, being a person of color was a very interesting experience. For most of my life, I was excluded. I was pointed out by teachers and by students for the color of my skin and for my accent. Same thing with my parents. My parents were also pointed out because of their accents, but also the fact that, thinking about my experiences, the intersections of being a person of color, being a Pinay, being a working class and first generation in a community that was predominantly white was challenging. I never thought that I personally belonged within that community. Um, and so, in addition to growing up in this predominantly white community, I grew up with very, I would say, I guess people would say, quote unquote, Filipino parents. And so what that meant is that I grew up in a very traditional Catholic household, where, my parents believe that, I should go to church. I mean, I went to church school, um, or what do you call that? Yeah, church school, for most of my life. Not that there's anything wrong with that. I identify as someone that's Catholic, but the values that were placed upon me, the values of, where a woman should be in the household, that we should be housewives, and et cetera, and et cetera. But also some general, like, things about skin color and body image, what I should look like. I should be light skin. I should be skinny. And in my opinion, I was opposite from that. Um, those were kind of the experiences and things that I've learned growing up. But that all changed when I went to San Jose State University. Very interesting experience. I didn't necessarily go to San Jose State right after high school. I went to community college, solely because my parents couldn't afford it. But going to San Jose State University and going to college in general was a challenging experience for me as someone who identifies as first generation and a person of color. There was many challenges that I had. I didn't know where financial aid was. I didn't know how to fill out financial aid forms. Um, I didn't know where to get mentorship. Um, I didn't know where to get help. So I remember my first year in community college, I was on academic probation. I had a grade point average of a 1.0. And so, eventually I got it together. I was able to get help from the Educational Opportunity Program, and eventually I transferred to San Jose State University with the 3.0 grade point average. So thankful for those type of resources. But when I transferred to San Jose State University, I transferred as a sociology major, um, and a minor in Asian American Studies. And my parents didn't necessarily agree with my decision. As immigrant parents, they wanted the best for me, but they wanted the best for me as long as I was making money. So when they found out that I was a sociology major, it was a whole conversation around what I was going to do and if I was going to make enough money. But I love sociology and I love Asian American studies, um, and they're so. And I loved Asian American studies. And even though at the time I didn't know where I was going to end up, it was important to me. But being a part of college changed my life. I was involved. I was a leader, was involved with many activist groups, protesting for educational rights, but it was also a time for me to explore my identity. Um, explore my identity. And so, being with folks of people, who really helped me understand what it means to be a person of color, a woman of color, and etc. And so, in the midst of understanding more about who I am and being a part of Asian American studies, I was able to relate my identities to the history of the Philippines, that understanding that Spanish colonization, the Philippine American War, the Japanese invasion, Marcos era, and martial law affected directly who I am as a person. These are my grandparents, and my grandparents were there when it all happened. And so thinking of ways in which they were colonized and they were forced to communicate these messages to my grandparents and to my parents and now to me. This quote really resonated with me. Colonial mentality among Filipinos and Filipino Americans is a form of internalized oppressions characterized by perception of ethnic or cultural inferiority, reinforcing the belief that Filipinos are intellectually inferior. Such internalization may lead to feelings of shame, embarrassment, or resentment. So, going back to the photo of me here in my debutante ball, feeling like I wasn't enough. And a lot of that was pretty much related to this history and this history of my grandparents. And so, and also in the midst of learning about who I was and the history, that I also learned about ways we empowered each other, empowered the community around us. Um, Learning about Gabriela Silong, the fall of the I Hotel, the People Revolution was empowering me at the same time. And similarly, in the midst of everything that was happening, this is a picture of my grandparents. They were resilient. They were a part of it. They were a part of these wars, and oftentimes being a part of these wars, whether they agreed or disagreed with it, was a part of resistance. And so this is another thing that resonated with me too. Rejecting colonial mentalities that have been passed on through generation of colonized peoples by teaching people to decolonize themselves is beyond developing self-esteem. It's taking action. And it's true, because while exploring identities and history is important, and I strongly believe that taking action is important, because as someone who understands the history and the impact of colonization, it's important that we as a community take action in it. And so I did. I protested. I protested, and I was involved on campus, as I've mentioned, and I saw the effects and I saw the changes that were made by student voices and by leaders and administrations on campus. And I wanted to devote myself to it. And it really influenced my social justice vision of community, justice, culture, identity, love, and the use and advocacy. Um, After learning all these history and being a part of San Jose State, I wanted to dedicate my life, I wanted to dedicate my profession to this. And I did. I went to the University of San Francisco to receive my master's in higher education and student affairs for this specifically, because I strongly believe in education. I believe that there's spaces for us. And this is where I am now. These are my students. Some are Pinay, Asian, but this is where I have chose to be in my life, because I strongly believe in empowering students, but also being the voice at the table. But the reality for Pinays in higher education, I briefly talked about my experiences navigating in higher education as a student, but a lot of that experiences are very similar as a professional. So a little bit about Asian American and Pinay representation in higher education. As you can see, in total, Asian Americans, we make up 10% of the academic population amongst professors and administrators. I don't have the exact numbers for how many people, what it looks like specifically for Filipino, but these are some statistics that I pulled from California Community College's personnel. Fortunately, they had data disaggregated here, and so this is what the Filipino and Pinay or Filipino breakdown looks like within community colleges. And as you can see, it's not very much different in compared to the national statistics. But if you look at Filipinos in higher education, in education administration, which are people like me, we make up 2%, tenure 1%, academic temp 1%, class admin temp 2%, class professor 4%, class support 3%. So really interesting dynamics going on here. And what this data doesn't tell us is, what does it look like in terms of gender breakdown? So amongst this percent, what does the percentage look like for the number of women, the number of men, and the number of trans folks that identify as Filipino in higher education? It's probably a lot smaller, and I can tell you it is, because whenever I go to these national conferences, it's really hard to see people who look like me. When I do, we literally gravitate towards each other. And so the lack of Pinays in higher education affects a sense of belonging. If you don't see anyone that looks like you, I mean, who can you relate to, right? So it's really that simple. And then the people, if you don't see people that look like you, or if there's not people there, there's no mentorship. There's no mentorship of people who can guide you, who look like you, who come from the same culture as you, who can guide you through the process and that understand what you're going through. And because there's the lack of Filipinos in academia, there's also lack of scholarship, which then influences policy. And we experience racism too. This is a flyer that was posted at UCLA about specifically about Asian women. It's a very overt forms of racism, but also the microaggressions that we experience. And for those who don't know what microaggressions are, they're basically they're brief, common, daily, verbal, behavioral, or environmental indignities, whether intentional or intentional, that communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative racial slights and insults towards people of color. And they could be verbal or nonverbal. And so examples of which, and these are things I experience on a daily basis. I've gotten feedback of, oh, Diana, you're so abrasive. Well, why am I abrasive? Because I'm doing my job, because I'm assertive. And so these are some, and then, you know, the typical Filipinos eat dogs, right? And you're so articulate. Of course I'm articulate. And then cultural and systemic barriers that Pinays experience, going back to the quote around colonial mentality, the things that we learned in our households. So for example, for me as a Pinay or as a Filipino, I was always taught to never speak up to my elders. So if we're in the workforce, when it comes to advocating for myself, when it comes to talking to elders, it's challenging for me. I really have to dig deep down and ask myself, okay, are they, you know, like, where is this coming from? Where are these feelings coming from? And I realized that they come from some of the things that I learned from my parents of not talking to elders, and they probably learned it from their grandparents or their great grandparents, and how they weren't supposed to be talking to their colonizers. So a lot of that is very much interconnected to our history and to how we navigate the workforce today. Some of the expectations and stereotypes that we experience, the expectations to be mothers and housewives. You know, it's real. I have multiple conversations with my parents and with my family about, you know, my profession. You know, when are you going to settle down, Diana? When are you going to have children? Well, what if I don't want to have children? What if I want to build my career first? And this idea that we're submissive. The fact that, you know, there's less than 2%, 4% of us in higher education. The fact that, you know, we have these model minority stereotypes placed on Asian Americans in general, and the fact that I'm in higher ed is very much, people are challenged by that. People are challenged by seeing a Pinay in higher education because they're not used to it. They're used to us being submissive. They're not used to us being assertive in the workforce. They're not used to seeing us advocating for social justice. They're used to seeing us in STEM, but we're not all in STEM. Some of us are in higher education. And so I think my personal views on empowerment and self and personal agency, I think this is important in terms of understanding the challenges that we experience in higher education. When you understand that, it's important to understand, how do you empower yourself? How do you create personal agency for yourself? For me, and the reason why I bring up my story is because my story is very much who I am, and it's how I constantly ground myself. But at the same time, the struggle gets a little real sometimes. It's tiring. So figuring out ways to be sustainable for me is how I see empowerment, and it's how I see personal agency. So I love this equation that I made. Empowerment plus self-agency equals identity and values and community. So it's kind of like PEMDAS, right? So your identity influences your values. Your identity influences the communities that you're in. So again, I think it's really important to understand where you come from and the ways in which you navigate the communities and the world around you based on your identities and based on where your values are and your communities. I want to go back to this quote: rejecting colonial mentalities that have been passed on through generation of colonized people by teaching people to decolonize themselves is beyond developing self-esteem. It's taking action. So yes, going back to the fact that it's important to understand where you come from and where you're grounded in, but taking action is important. And for me, again, taking action is very much grounded in self-care and sustainability. So what does that look like for me? So number one, know what your triggers are, understand what they are, because understanding what your triggers are will allow you to respond in a oppressive situation in ways that can advocate for yourself. So if you know what you're triggered by, then you know how to navigate it. Not that you're trying to make people feel comfortable in the situations, but at the same time, understanding that if you know what your triggers are, you know how to respond to them. And so being able to know how to respond to them it's actually pretty powerful. And understanding that triggers are ongoing. I mean, that's just the reality of it, is that um, triggers based on your experiences, based on who you interact with, are ongoing. There's new ones that come up every now and then, but understanding how triggers feel like for you. I know that for me, when I'm triggered, I know that I get hot. I know I start crying. I know when that happens, I know that I'm triggered. But also identifying, when triggers do happen, what does support look like for you? What do you need in that space? But for me, I know that when I am triggered, sometimes it's advocating for myself. Sometimes it's space. With that, self-care is important. The picture of the right is me doing yoga. Yoga is so important to my life because at the end of a workday, it keeps me grounded. It keeps me grounded, but also reminds me why I do the work that I do. And so, in terms of self care, you have to ask yourself, what do you need to be sustainable in relationships, school, work, etc. Right? So, is it working out? Is it your spirituality? Is it sleeping? Is it eating? I tell my students all the time, you need to eat, you need to go to sleep, because if you don't have your basic needs, how are you going to function in the world, right? While also thinking about what makes you feel good. Is it being around friends? Is it being around family? And also, a lot of people will say, oh, my self care is to go to the movies once a month or go do this. But no, you need to be proactive with your self care. And that's why I love doing yoga, because I go to yoga like every day. And this is me being proactive with my self care, but also sleeping and eating and making sure that I'm doing it. Because if I cannot take care of myself, I can't take care of others, and I can't be sustainable in what I want to do, which is social justice. 3, support. The people to the right are the people um, that have been supporting me since grad school. These are folks. I am a part of the California Council of Cultural Centers in Higher Education, and these are the people on the e-board. They've supported me through the process, even though they don't self-identify as Pinay or Pinoy. They've been so supportive to me. They understand what it means to work in multicultural affairs. But support could look different for different people. Support could be mentors, friends, family, or people who just understand, and it could be affinity groups. And also, joining national affinity-based organizations is so important. The people to the right, we found all the Pinoys and Pinays in higher education while we were at NASPA. These are not all the Pinoys and Pinays, I'm sorry. But while we were at a Western regional conference, we always make it a point for all the Pinoys and Pinays to connect with each other. But like at these specific organizations like NASPA, they have specific API knowledge communities. They have networks, but they also actually have an organization called the Asian Pacific Americans in Higher Education, called the PAHI, a really great resource for folks thinking about going into higher education. But also, affinity spaces are so important. As I've mentioned, being a part of cross-cultural centers has been so important to me. So I'd encourage you all to go to your cross-cultural centers if learning about identity, if learning about social justice is something that you're passionate about. Ethnic studies is important too. So is gender and sexuality studies, but also reading. Reading about folks, scholars that resonate with me are Bell Hooks, Grace Lee Boggs, Jerry Kochiyama. I recently got into learning more about Dr. Cheryl Matthias's readings. She's an amazing Pinay scholar that writes about Pinay and Pinoy issues, whether they're within higher ed or outside of higher ed. And then joining grassroots organizations. That's all I have today. But remember, consciousness is power. Tomorrow's world is yours to build. So again, thank you all for having me today. I know that they're going to Skype me in for a Q&A session right now. So yeah, thank you all, and looking forward to your questions.